What's going on, guys? Wade here. I'm out with Mike Rowley, who's been working on getting veteran stones ordered and placed. And a lot of you have been asking me, how do you do that? Mike's our local expert on this and has been doing this for a number of years now and has done hundreds of stones. So I asked him if he'd join us and talk a little bit about what his process is for getting this and what does the Veterans Administration require for the documentation of getting headstones ordered for veterans that don't have a headstone in place, whether that's somebody more recently or from a long ago past. So Mike, maybe just tell us a little bit about how you got started doing this, and then we'll step in and talk about what the process is. So first off, what was that inspiration for getting started and finding the veterans that didn't have a headstone, maybe a burial that wasn't marked?
You know, my father was a World War II veteran, and while he was lucky enough to make it back from the war, his death was later determined to be 100% service connected. Died when I was 8 years old, and so we spent a lot of time at the cemetery. And as I would be walking around as a kid and later as an adult, I'd see people that weren't marked, and I'd wonder, well, why not? And so I guess that was kind of the impetus that got me to figuring a way to rectify that and mark the graves that had not been marked.
How many do you think you've actually worked on? This is a couple hundred?
I know that we're closing, we're past 250 and closing on around 270.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So when you find a grave that's not marked, I'm assuming there's people that tell you about that, because I've told you about that,
Sure.
where I've come across some, and then you've done the paperwork. But talk me through, just bullet point of what's the process and what's the documentation that's required by the Veterans Administration for doing that, and maybe what's the time frame with it?
So a couple of different things. First of all, on finding a veteran that his grave hasn't been marked, sometimes like yourself, people show me and tell me that, hey, I think this guy hasn't been marked. Other ways that if you look at your newspapers back in years past, you'll notice on Memorial Day or around that time, they'd print huge lists of all the veterans they were going to honor. And so I'd go through that list, I'd find out who doesn't have a stone, and then figure out if there's a way that we could get them marked. So that's been very helpful.
So you've gone through older lists, but then, for somebody that so let's use the example of the one that I presented to you the other day. So,
Sure.
so I was out in a cemetery, I was looking for projects to work on. I came across some records of somebody that was buried there, took a photo and sent it over to Mike and said, Mike, is this one that we could take a look at? And so what did you do when you saw that email from me? And then what was the documentation that was required for you to get that ordered? Because I know that came through.
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting stone. So there was just part of a name, Emily, on the stone and a year. So I started Googling Emily and looking on research and who could be buried in that Des Moines cemetery. Found her husband. He was a veteran of the Civil War. So then what the VA requires is that you document his military service. And that's easily done through different records that are available, maybe GAR, Grand Army of the Republic records. He was a Civil War veteran, maybe Ancestry.com, Fold 3. There's a lot of different sources. Once we determined his military service, then we also determined or had to take a photo of the grave, that there was no existing stone there, and submitted an application to the VA. It's really just a one-page document. It's not hard, and approval came pretty fast on that one. Well, this cemetery for us, so it's 175 years old. It's hard to find a straight line in here. There is no set amount. We usually go about 18 inches from the bottom to the ground. That leaves about 25 inches of stone sticking above the ground. And as I mentioned before, we put cement in them in the past, and it's problematic when they do shift. They're hard to fix and repair and adjust, and we've been told it's better to do them without cement. So we dig the hole, we leave some loose soil in the bottom so that we can adjust it to be level.
I know that there was a big fire a number of years ago where a lot of records were destroyed. So what type of documentation is required, and what types of things have you been successful with when you found proof of their service?
So the military requires something of a military document. Mm-hmm. So for instance, you mentioned the fire. That mostly affects the World War I, World War II era veterans. That fire destroyed a lot of their records. So that can be problematic. They won't accept something from, say for instance, the Iowa National Guard. They won't accept something from the newspaper. It's got to be a military document. Mm-hmm. And if you look hard enough, we can find those, and I can, show different sources of where to find those.
And so you found, so what are some of those sources would be? So you said Ancestry.com, Fold 3.
Yeah, also, and you can just Google, if you know what unit they were in, maybe they're in the 2nd Iowa Infantry.
Yep.
You can Google 2nd Iowa Infantry roster, and those records are available online for no charge normally.
Okay.
Newspaper articles can lead you in directions of family members, and maybe you go to Ancestry.com and see what other people have found already, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. Okay, so we've got documentation.
Yep.
That's in place. And then it's a one-page form. I've seen the form,
correct,
but I'm not familiar with filling that out. So what all was on the form that's required of that? And then do you need interaction with the family, or do you need interaction with the cemetery, or who do you need to get permission from to do that? So you're an outside person. Now, I know we have a relationship with our local cemetery, but for somebody that's doing this outside of their, maybe our connection that we have, who would they have to contact within their local cemetery or the family, things like that?
So we do have good relationships with the cemeteries where we put in a lot of stones, but I've actually put in stones in 7 different states. So I try to contact the cemetery, get their approval and their permission that they'll allow the stone. Most of them are very easy to work with. Maybe, and then also you ask about family. I try to track down descendants and get their approval, because you certainly want to have approval of the family before we do anything as personal as putting a stone on. And while there's usually some skepticism because they're hearing from a stranger, not quite sure what I'm doing, once they understand, then the first thing I usually get is a thank you.
Yeah, I see that with myself as well. When I'm doing work with these stones and resetting them, you contact family, and then they're like, well, who are you and what are you up to?
Yeah.
And then when they realize it, they're like, oh, that's really super cool. So you've proved who the person is, you've documented their service record, and then it's, what is it, name, address, phone number kind of thing? With the
actually,
cemetery
it is.
It's
And it doesn't have to be complete. It's got to be as complete as possible. So some of the questions are, who was the veteran? When were they born? When did they die? Some of the times that information is complete, sometimes it isn't. You'll see that on the stones, how much is put on the stone.
Yeah.
They might ask you when they mustered in, when they mustered out, what branch of the service they were part of. The block and lot number of the grave, and the contact person at the cemetery. The other thing that the application will ask is who's going to take delivery of the stone, and sometimes it's a cemetery. In most cases, I'm retired, and it's just easier for me to just take delivery of it at my home, and
so you can send so delivery can be received to a private address. You've taken on that responsibility, and then you provide the installation services of the stone.
That's the way I've done it, just because it's just easier to control as much of it as I can.
Absolutely. There's probably challenges that come about with this. What are some of the issues that you found along the way, or the hiccups that come in, and how have you kind of resolved some of those with your experience? So a lot of people may not have any experience with this, and so what are some of those best practices that they're...
First of all, I would say start small. If even one out of every 1,000 of your viewers would attempt and just get one grave marked, it would make such an impact for so many families and so many veterans that it would be outstanding. So keep it simple. And what I've done is started with one, deliver the stone. Some of the issues that I've come up with and some of the more difficult ones, I've been working on one individual for about 3 years, Edward T. Banks. He was one of the first officers in the Iowa National Guard. He was a man of African descent. In 1880, he was a captain in the Iowa National Guard, which was quite unusual. However, we've only been able to prove his service in the Iowa National Guard. So many of the colored troops, as they were called then, their records are spotty at best, and we haven't proven his federal service to the satisfaction of the Veterans Administration. So that's been a frustrating one that we haven't yet got him a stone, but we will.
The genealogists in us love a challenge, so sometimes those roadblocks are challenging, but we appreciate the effort that goes into that.
You kind of have to be a detective, and you wake up in the middle of the night with a great idea.
So the section that we're in here is the World War section. Have you done some of the work in this particular area, or were these all marked?
Well, most of these have been previously marked. We have helped replace a couple of them that were damaged over the time, and It's interesting you mentioned it is called the World War I veteran section, and the stone over there signifies that. It was never supposed to be a World War I section because there was never supposed to be a World War II, but we all know how that went. The research on World War I and World War II can be a little complicated because in the early 1970s, the National Archives had a huge fire and a lot of the records were destroyed. So we had where he had applied for some veterans benefits through the state, but the federal government wouldn't accept that as one of their documents. We were having trouble getting any documents from the archives because of the fire. And then I was able to get, he died in another state. I was able to get a death certificate, and it showed that he died in a veterans hospital, and they finally gave in to us. But this one was a little longer process than most. Most go very smoothly, and this was a little more complicated, so it's a little more satisfying too.
So what are the things that I haven't asked you about that we should know about when it comes to getting these headstones in place? Are there any other specific rules that might be out there that people need to be aware of, or hazards or trip-ups that you've stumbled across? Since you've done so many of this, you're probably one of the unique folks.
I guess my best practice is whoever you need to get approval from, whether it be a cemetery official or the Veterans Administration or anyone, try to make their job as easy as possible. If it's filling out the application, I fill out everything except the cemetery's official and the date that he signed it, or she signed it, because if I can make it easy for them, it's just one less roadblock. If I'm sending records to the VA, I send them in as complete with notes as possible. Just try to make the other person's job easier.
So what you're saying is do what we would expect in your traditional day job?
I think so, yeah.
That's amazing, Mike. So I really appreciate that. That's really great information. And after a couple hundred of these, you've experienced a lot. So I appreciate that. I'm sure they appreciate that. So thanks a lot, Mike.
Start with the first one.
Get one. It's like when we talk about cleaning and resetting, just start with one. Start small, just get your way into it. You don't need to take on a massive project that's where you're gonna expect to get hundreds of stones reset or cleaned or burials marked. Just start with one. Take that small step and get it done. Thanks.